In 1855, when a British physician named Thomas Addison first documented a mysterious condition causing profound weakness and darkening skin, the diagnosis was an absolute death sentence. Today, thanks to synthetic hormones, patients live long lives, but they trade a fatal diagnosis for a complicated, lifelong balancing act. We are looking at a recent article from My Adrenal Life that dissects the quiet tension that grows in relationships affected by adrenal insufficiency. The piece explores how roles shift during moments of crisis, leading to guilt and emotional distance for both the patient and the caregiver. But we need to push past just identifying the problem. We are going to break down the physiological reality of adrenal insufficiency, examine the specific relationship strain it causes, and figure out how to create healthy boundaries that keep both people feeling safe, seen, and heard without deteriorating the relationship.
The starting point has to be understanding that adrenal insufficiency is not a matter of low energy or a bad mood. It is a fundamental breakdown in the body's stress response system. The adrenal glands fail to produce sufficient cortisol and sometimes aldosterone. The National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases explains that cortisol plays a central role in maintaining blood pressure, regulating blood sugar, and managing the body's response to physical or emotional strain. When a person does not have enough cortisol, everyday stressors become physiological mountains. A simple cold, an argument, or a missed meal can trigger a cascade of severe symptoms. The My Adrenal Life article points out that low cortisol causes brain fog, slowed thinking, and irritability. These are not personality flaws. They are direct physiological responses to a hormone deficit.
That distinction between personality and physiology seems central to the friction that develops in these relationships. If a partner or family member sees the patient becoming withdrawn or irritable, the natural human instinct is to take it personally. The caregiver might interpret that withdrawal as emotional distance or rejection. Meanwhile, the patient is experiencing a literal system failure. They are withdrawing because their brain and body lack the chemical fuel required to process stimuli. The article captures this dynamic perfectly. The patient feels like a burden, and the caregiver feels overwhelmed, and then feels guilty for feeling overwhelmed. It creates a cycle of unspoken resentment.
That cycle is well documented in chronic illness research. Studies on caregiver burden, such as those looking at congenital adrenal hyperplasia and adrenal insufficiency, show that caregivers experience high rates of depression, anxiety, and disruption to their daily lives. The caregiver is thrust into a hypervigilant state. They become responsible for monitoring someone else's physical stability, often without a clear roadmap. In an adrenal crisis, the stakes are life and death. The Cleveland Clinic defines an adrenal crisis as a state where the body lacks enough cortisol to maintain essential functions, leading to severe weakness, confusion, and dangerously low blood pressure. If not treated rapidly with intravenous fluids and stress dose steroids, it can be fatal. So the caregiver is not just helping out around the house. They are acting as a first responder.
That brings up the issue of unpredictability. The My Adrenal Life piece notes that someone might feel stable one day and be completely incapacitated the next. The inconsistency is confusing for the patient, but it must be terrifying for the caregiver. They never know if today is a normal day or a day that ends in an emergency room visit. And in those crisis moments, communication breaks down. The patient might be too disoriented to articulate what they need. The caregiver feels an intense pressure to act fast and make the right medical decisions. After the crisis passes, the emotional residue remains. The caregiver might carry lingering fear, while the patient might feel exposed and vulnerable.
Exactly. And because both people care about each other, they try to protect each other by not talking about that emotional residue. The patient thinks, I am already asking so much of them, I cannot complain about my feelings of guilt. The caregiver thinks, they almost died, I have no right to complain about being stressed. The silence feels protective, but it actually breeds isolation. The article highlights that these dynamics show up in small, repeated moments. It is not always a full-blown crisis. It is the canceled plans, the conversations that are hard to follow, the simple decisions that take too much energy. Over time, the constant adjustments pull people out of.
Let us transition to the actionable part of this discussion. The prompt demands we explore how to build healthy relationships and boundaries in the face of this unpredictable illness. If the foundation of the strain is a physiological deficit that cannot be cured, the solution has to lie in how the couple or family unit navigates the space between them. We need to look at frameworks for communication that remove the moral weight from the symptoms.
The first step is externalizing the disease. The symptoms of low cortisol, the brain fog, the exhaustion, the short temper, must be viewed as a third entity in the room, rather than a failure of the patient. When a patient says, "I cannot attend this event," they are not rejecting the caregiver or the shared social life. They are reporting a biological fact. Experts in chronic illness communication often recommend using I statements that separate the feeling from the disease. Instead of the caregiver saying, "You never want to do anything," they can say, "I feel isolated when we have to cancel plans, but I understand your body needs rest." This acknowledges the caregiver's valid emotional experience without blaming the patient for their illness.
That requires a significant amount of self-awareness from both parties. The caregiver has to accept that their feelings of frustration are valid, even if the patient is not at fault. It is a strange paradox. You are allowed to be angry at the situation without being angry at the person. But practically speaking, how do boundaries function when one person's basic survival might depend on the other? If I am a caregiver, setting a boundary like, "I need an hour to myself," feels impossible if I am terrified my partner might collapse while I am in the other room.
Boundary setting in the context of adrenal insufficiency requires strategic planning. It means establishing secondary support systems so the primary caregiver is not the sole point of failure. It means educating friends and extended family about the signs of low cortisol and how to administer an emergency injection if necessary. By widening the safety net, the primary caregiver can take the space they need to recharge without feeling negligent. Setting boundaries also involves proactive communication during stable periods. You cannot negotiate boundaries during a crisis. When cortisol levels are adequate and both people are calm, that is the time to discuss limits. The patient can articulate what signs indicate they are slipping into a low cortisol state, and the caregiver can articulate what they need to feel supported in their role.
The historical context of this disease actually provides an interesting parallel to the idea of resilience. Thomas Addison suffered from severe bouts of depression himself and struggled with his own mental stability while trying to convince the medical establishment that the adrenal glands were essential for life. He was observing an illness that systematically drained the life force from his patients, and he was doing it while fighting his own internal battles. It underscores the fact that the human capacity to endure complex, overlapping struggles is profound. A patient managing Addison's disease today is fighting a continuous internal battle for equilibrium, while the caregiver is fighting a parallel battle against burnout.
That parallel is vital. Both battles are real, and neither negates the other. The My Adrenal Life article touches on this beautifully. It states that needing help during a crisis does not erase a person's independence, and feeling overwhelmed as a caregiver does not erase their care. In a healthy relationship, both people must be allowed to grieve the life they thought they would have. There is a grieving process for the spontaneity that the illness steals. Acknowledging that grief together rather than hiding it from each other is a powerful way to rebuild connection.
It seems the ultimate goal is moving from a dynamic of dependence and resentment to a dynamic of structured interdependence. It involves radical honesty. If the patient is experiencing cognitive slowing, they need to be able to say, "My processing speed is at 10% right now. I need you to make this decision." And the caregiver needs the freedom to say, "I am reaching my capacity for making decisions today. We need to defer this." It is about treating the body's energy and the caregiver's emotional bandwidth as shared, finite resources that must be budgeted.
Budgeting is the perfect analogy. Just as you cannot spend money you do not have, you cannot spend cortisol you do not have. And you cannot demand emotional labor from a caregiver whose reserves are empty. Healthy boundaries mean respecting those limits without assigning moral blame. It also means recognizing that the relationship is more than the illness. While the illness dictates certain routines, it should not be the only topic of conversation.
Carving out time to connect over shared interests, even in low-energy ways, reinforces the romantic or familial bond that existed before the diagnosis.
We have covered the biological mechanisms, the historical weight of the diagnosis, the specific emotional traps identified in the My Adrenal Life article, and concrete strategies for establishing boundaries. The core takeaway is that the strain in these relationships is a natural response to a physiological crisis, not a sign of broken love. By externalizing the disease, validating the caregiver's burden, and establishing clear, guilt-free communication during stable moments, couples can navigate the unpredictability of adrenal insufficiency together. Share this episode with someone who might find it useful.